Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Managing Compliance Risks to Avoid Fines and Reputational Damage. My name is Amanda Brief. I'm the Marketing Director here at ClauseMatch, and I'm going to be your moderator for today. Before we get started, we just have a couple of housekeeping items. All panelists except the speakers are muted. If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat box. Additionally, if you have any questions specifically for the speakers, just put them in the Q&A box. And lastly, an email of the slides and recording will be sent no later than this Thursday. Now, I wanted to just kind of quickly introduce ClauseMatch. We're an award-winning regulatory technology company. We have a huge global presence across the US, Europe, and Asia as well. We also support global clients. Here's just kind of an example of some of the clients that we have. Everything from financial services to insurance to fintech organizations. Now I'll quickly introduce today's speaker. We have GRC expert Michael Rasmussen. Michael helps organizations improve GRC processes, design and implement GRC architecture, and select solutions that are effective, efficient, and agile. Our second speaker is no other than my fellow colleague, Nick Mellis, Principal Consultant here at ClauseMatch. Nick is a financial services professional who specializes in risk, compliance, regulatory affairs, and public policy. And with that, I'll quickly go through today's agenda. Michael's going to kick it off and talk through the type of fines organizations are getting from a compliance standpoint and how to avoid these same pitfalls. Then he'll talk through tips to help organizations identify current gaps in their compliance processes and avoid reputational risk. Lastly, Nick and Michael will go through how technology solutions can help you tighten up your control environment, including policies and procedures. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Michael to kick off the webinar.
It is a pleasure to be here today, and I'm looking forward to spending this virtual hour with everybody. But, to put things in context of managing compliance risks to avoid fines and regulatory reputational damage, let's start with sort of painting the picture of what organizations are up against, particularly financial services organizations. The physicist Fritjof Capra stated, the more we study the major problems of our time, the more we come to realize that they cannot be understood in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they are interconnected and interdependent. That's the challenge in today's modern financial services organization in trying to manage compliance risks in the context of potential fines and reputational damage. It's an integrated risk environment. The whole COVID-19 and the pandemic for the past couple of years has illustrated that. What starts off with the health and safety risk issue cascades into growing risks of conduct risks and how we manage our client relationships from the home office and what can be overheard from a privacy standpoint with spouses and roommates and significant others, to how the conduct on Zoom calls and team meetings in a home office environment, to increase security risks in the home office environment, to a range of even growing bribery and corruption and other types of risks. It's an interconnected risk environment. And so often we manage compliance risks in little silos, like anti-money laundering risks, bribery and corruption risks, conduct risks, but really it's an interconnected risk environment. So often, conduct risk is really an operational risk type issue because somebody wasn't following a policy, or maybe they weren't trained properly, or the policy wasn't communicated to them. It's an interconnected risk environment. And so while the physicist here at the time of this quote was talking about biological ecosystems, it applies so well to trying to manage compliance in today's modern financial services organization. It is an interconnected risk environment. Our compliance risks are interdependent upon each other. And we have to carefully be able to manage this within the financial services organization. So next slide, please. So according to the Thomson Reuters Regulatory Intelligence Cost of Compliance 2021, in their survey and data that they did, one of the biggest challenges, because you can see by the size of the words in this word cloud here, is keeping up with regulatory change. That is the biggest problem that financial services firms are facing in compliance, is keeping up with the volume of regulatory change. But then you've also got a lot of things that relate to that and intersect with it, such as increased regulatory demands and expectations, the lack of skilled resources to be able to manage regulatory change, and so much more out there. But it is an interconnected environment. Just trying to keep up with regulatory change is a significant challenge in the financial services organization today. And let's unpack this a little bit in the next slide. Global financial services firms, according to the same Thomson Reuters report, are dealing with 257 regulatory change events every business day. That's 67,125 events over the year. 257 events each business day, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, 52 weeks out of the year. About 1/3 of those are coming from North America. And that's coming from 1,217 regulators that they monitor. That's a lot of change. Now, this change could be a new law or regulation, a proposed law or regulation, a notice of proposed rulemaking, some regulatory statement, but a lot of them are enforcement actions and how that regulation is being enforced by the regulators. Lots of changes to keep up on. But it's not just the regulatory change itself. It is also how that change impacts the business too, that we have to closely monitor. Because we can devote a ton of resources to be very intelligent about the law and the regulation, but does that make us actually compliant? No, it doesn't. Being knowledgeable about the law is not enough. You have to apply that into the organization in its operational context. And just as much as regulations are changing with 257 regulatory change events every business day, at the same time, your business is changing. Employees are changing. New ones come into the organization. Are they aware of the policies? Are they trained properly in compliance? They move from one department to another department, one role to another role, one function to another function. And are they aware of the compliance responsibilities and policies and controls in that new area? Are they trained properly in that area? Processes change, technology change, third parties change. We have to keep up with all this change in sync to be compliant and to be able to manage compliance risk to avoid fines and reputational damage. Knowledge about the law is just the first step. Making sure that we keep the organization compliant in a very dynamic and changing environment, that's the next step. We have to be able to manage that within the organization. On the next slide, you see that there's a lot of different fines and penalties. And talking to Claus Matches yesterday, we're just scratching the surface on this. Just looking at the largest regulatory fines in 2021, we have the Deutsche Bank fine of 120 million and FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. JP Morgan was fined 125 million for failure to comply in the preservation of communications. Credit Suisse, 147 million, again, in corruption. NatWest, 264 million pounds in compliance deficiencies. ABN AMRO, 480 million euros in money laundering allegations. And this is just scratching the surface. There's so many areas of IT security and privacy and even like HR related compliance needs and conduct and so forth. There's so much we can unpack. And some years there's more fines, other years there's less fines, but we do have growing regulations year over year over year. That regulations seem to increase. And we can see that by the Thomson Reuters stats that we had in the previous slide. There's a lot to keep up on to be able to manage compliance risks to avoid fines and reputational damage. But let's unpack that. Now, this is based on my experience. And this is a rough model because you can find different fines and penalties that go outside of this. But I find that as a model, and again, models are here to represent, but not always accurately the real world. But we want them to be as accurate as possible. So you can find outliers and things like that. But I find that the fine is one factor to consider. Then the investigation and response costs are another factor, and the ongoing monitoring costs are still another factor. So if the fine, and here, for example, we can use the Siemens Foreign Corrupt Practices Act violation from several years back. They had like an $850 million fine for FCPA. If the fine is 800 million, Most firms within that regulatory enforcement action are going to find that they're going to spend about an equal amount in the investigation response costs. So if the fine is projected to be 800 million, they've probably spent about 800 million also in the investigation response costs and legal fees and all that element of it. But then they have the enforcement where they have to have an ongoing monitor and reporting for the next 5 to 10 years, which can add another 20% to the costs. In this case, potentially 400 million. And so in the case of like this FCPA enforcement action, and again, I'm roughly using the Siemens as an example, what is an $800 million fine actually has a $2 billion cost on the organization, but that's not even considering the cost and lost opportunity and business reputation damage and other opportunity costs. But when we look at regulatory fines, it is not just the fine itself, but it's the cost of investigating and responding to it and the legal fees and everything else around that, and the fixing up and cleaning things up and reporting to the regulators for several years afterwards. In addition to that, we also have the very intangible costs of the reputation damage that all make it very hard to be able to put together. Now, moving forward, on the next slide, what's important also to understand is that there's a growing era of accountability, not just responsibility. And there's a very subtle but very distinct and powerful difference. Responsibilities I can give to somebody else. Responsibilities are tasks. I can take tasks and give them to somebody else to do. But accountability is the buck stops here. I'm ultimately accountable. So when it comes to different areas of regulatory compliance, to be able to manage compliance risks, to avoid fines and reputational damage, we want to move beyond responsibilities to also look at accountability. For different areas of compliance, who's actually accountable? Who owns the risk in those areas? That's absolutely critical. And around the world, we have a growing array of accountability regimes. The top of the pillar being the United Kingdom's with the FCA, PRA, Bank of England's senior managers regime and certification regime. There you have to define 28 senior management functions that have different accountability with responsibility maps for different areas of compliance and risk. And at the end of the day, those senior management functions can go to jail if there's willful misconduct, or they can be personally fined out of their bank account, not the bank's bank account, if there's negligence or lack of due diligence in different compliance and risk areas. Barclays' former CEO was fined £640,000 for a whistleblower infraction that he had to pay out of his bank account, his personal account, not the Barclays bank account. What started the United Kingdom's SMCR has gone around the world to Ireland's SEER, Senior Executive Accountability Regime, Australia's BEAR, what was the BEAR, Banking Executive Accountability Regime, now becoming FEAR. That's the best name for a regulation I've ever seen, the FEAR regulation, the Financial Executive Accountability Regime, Hong Kong's Managers in Charge, Singapore's Individual Accountability and Conduct Guidelines. All these are playing a particular interest in growing focus on accountability, not just responsibility for compliance. And those fines and penalties do not just apply in these regimes to the financial services organization, but actually to these senior management functions that operate there as well, that they are personally liable. That's all interesting pieces to note. Now, we looked around the world. Let's look at some of the stuff in the US. When you look at the US Department of Justice and their evaluation of compliance programs guidance, and this is updated every few years. It was last updated 2 years ago in June of 2020. They base it around three fundamental questions on what a compliance program should look like. The first question is the corporation's compliance program well designed? And from there, they look at things such as compliance risk assessments, clearly defined and documented policies and procedures, training and communication programs related to those policies and procedures that are in line with the compliance risks, confidential reporting structures and investigation processes, being able to manage third parties compliance risk, because the modern financial services organization isn't just about traditional brick and mortar business and employees. It is an extended web of third-party relationships. You walk down the halls of a bank or insurance company, asset management, a brokerage, whatever it might be, half the people you walk by aren't traditional employees. They are contractors, consultants, outsourcers, service providers, temporary workers, and you have to manage compliance risks, not just within traditional brick and mortar business, but across these extended third-party relationships. And then the final area to look at is the mergers and acquisitions. How is compliance dealt with during mergers and acquisitions? A lot of firms have inherited a significant issues of bribery and corruption and other conduct risks through M&A activities. So the first question the DOJ looks at is the corporation's compliance program well designed? Does it look right on paper? Are those policies and procedures written correctly? Do they address the compliance risks in programs? But next, and the next question you have to look at, is the program being applied earnestly and in good faith? In other words, is the program adequately resourced and empowered to function effectively? So here it's looking at, is there proper commitment by senior and middle management? Is there that proper tone at the top and even tone at the middle? Does the compliance program have the right autonomy and resources? We've seen over the last 15 years, a lot of corporate integrity agreements, non-prosecution agreements, deferred prosecution agreements, consent decrees that continuously want compliance to come outside of legal and to be its own an autonomous entity in the organization to report to the executives and the board of directors. Now, I do know good compliance programs are important to legal, but from an idealistic standpoint, the thinking goes that legal has the duty to deny and protect, while compliance has a duty to discover and fix. These can be at odds with each other. And so we see a growing array of enforcement actions from the Department of Justice and SEC and other regulators that want compliance to report outside of legal. And in some areas that some organizations I've worked with, they've got legal compliance within legal that interprets the laws and regulation and applies them to the organization's context. But then they have operational compliance where the chief ethics and compliance officer sits that's responsible for managing compliance on a day-to-day basis. But the question that the DOJ is asking here, is the program being applied earnestly and in good faith? In other words, is the program adequately resourced and empowered to function effectively? And again, that's getting to the commitment by executives and management, autonomy and resources, and having the proper incentives and disciplinary measures. Finally, the third fundamental question that the Department of Justice looks at is, does the corporation's compliance program work in practice? You remember the first question was, is the corporation's compliance program well designed? Does it look good on paper? The third question is it actually working? What is on paper, does it actually function? Is that the behavior of the organization? Here, the DOJ looks at continuous improvement, periodic testing and review of compliance, that there's proper investigation into misconduct that's being reported, and that there's analysis and remediation of any underlying misconduct. That if you have those proper policies and out there and training, that people are actually being communicated the policies and trained properly. Just one example. So those are the three fundamental questions from the Department of Justice on compliance programs to help organizations manage compliance risk to avoid fines and reputational damage. Another important theme from a US perspective to portray in here is the US Department of Justice and the United States Sentencing Commission perspective. We just went through the DOJ questions that are on the left, but then we also should closely look at the US Sentencing Commission. You know, the Department of Justice guidance with those three questions helps them determine the culpability if they're going to actually prosecute a financial services organization or other organization. The US Sentencing Commission, organizational sentencing practices, which is on the right, that is, once there is a prosecution, this helps define the actual enforcement of that from a penalty, whether it's on criminal regulatory matters. And the USSC, the United States Sentencing Commission, has what I call these 7 elements of highly effective compliance programs. These are the things that the courts use in defining fines and penalties and even prison sentences in criminal compliance nature. And there's actually an 8th one too, but we'll get to that. And that starts with oversight, accountability, and resources. Who's in charge? Who's accountable, not just responsible for compliance? I already got into that. That you have to have proper oversight, accountability, and resources. That there's, for different areas of compliance, somebody needs to be accountable. The second is standards and controls. Those are your policies. Are your policies properly defined and written clearly? The third one is effective training and communication. Are those policies understood in your environment? The fourth, ongoing evaluation, monitoring, and auditing of compliance, and that policies are adhered to. The fifth is the enforcement of compliance and proper discipline and incentives. The sixth is making sure that you have due care and delegating authorities, that you're not giving access to sensitive processes and information to individuals that have a bent towards criminal behavior, going to background checks and so forth. And the seventh is response and continuous improvement. The eighth element, what I call the eighth habit of compliance, is again, that compliance risk assessment, understanding continuously your compliance risks. Now, the courts use this as a mitigating factor. If you have these elements in place, this can significantly reduce your fines and penalties from a criminal enforcement of prosecution. And so having these elements in place can directly impact and reduce the overall fines and penalties that the courts put upon the organization. And so both from the regulator standpoint, like the Department of Justice on the left, and then the courts from the prosecution, from the actual final penalty standpoint on the right, both these have a significant portrayal in the United States on managing compliance risks to avoid fines. Now, let's move on here. So in summary here from this first section, some of the drivers and trends I'm seeing in compliance management. We have the drivers first. The drivers drive the trends. We have a lot of regulatory change. And so we have a significant amount, 257 regulatory change events every business day. That includes 67,125 regulatory change events in 2020. Now, we also have to keep up with all the business change, because monitoring, managing the regulatory change by itself isn't enough. You have to make sure that that change is being kept current in the context of the organization. From there, there's the enforcement actions, that there's that we have been growing enforcement of compliance and increased penalties and fines. We have the need for evidence of compliance. You unpack a lot of those DOJ requirements, and there's a great need for the evidence of compliance and being able to monitor and provide evidence. Particularly, I mean, you look at the DOJ guidance from the last couple of years, part of the things they look for is who read policies, who accessed policies, and having that system of record and audit trail for evidence of compliance. And now all those three, regulatory change, enforcement actions, evidence of compliance, are all drivers for implementing stronger processes and technology. But the fourth one is that a lot of organizations are finding that as they try to address those first three drivers, they're finding that they have scattered approaches. That a lot of times compliance management in the financial services organizations looks like the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California. This is this mansion that was built in the 1800s. It took 38 years to build, had 147 different builders. But it had no design, no blueprint, no architect. At the end of the day, it has doors that open to walls, or 20-foot drops, staircases that go up or down to nowhere. It doesn't make any sense. This is how a lot of financial services organizations have approached compliance, that over the last 38 years, they've had 147 different builders of compliance. And they find out that they've got, like, one company I was talking to, an insurance company, that they had 28 different policy portals in the organization, and policies look different and different templates in these portals. And it was confusing. These scattered approaches make trying to manage compliance and being able to manage compliance risks, reduce fines and reputational damage hard. So the fourth driver is those scattered approaches. And the fifth driver is the one I already touched on, is compliance independence, where compliance is being really required by the regulators to become its own entity in the organization, and not just something buried in the depths of the legal department. The trends coming out of this is the need for greater regulatory intelligence. How do we keep abreast of changing laws and regulations? How do we leverage artificial intelligence and cognitive technologies to be able to read regulations and understand the changes and impact on that? From there, we have compliance risk management. We have growing pressure from regulators that's demanding that regular compliance risk assessments for non-compliant behavior be done. And compliance roles are quickly learning how to define and monitor compliance risk. Now, my favorite compliance risk assessment methodology is bow tie risk assessments. I love bow ties, and as a form dress, but also I love bow ties as a form of risk assessment. The third trend is federating compliance. There's not just one department of compliance. You've got, corporate compliance and ethics responsible for the big picture. You got fraud compliance, other accounting and financial compliance, and credit risk compliance, market risk compliance, operational risk compliance, IT risk, and IT compliance, and conduct compliance, and HR compliance, harassment and discrimination, inclusion, diversity, now ESG on environmental compliance within banks, and so much. And so we need to really herd the cats, and all these different departments and functions of compliance need to work together collaboratively. So that's what I call federated compliance. This comes into a compliance platform and architecture, like our host clause match, to be able to help monitor regulatory change and communicate policies and manage policies, keep them current in the environment, provide that defensible audit trail and evidence of compliance, but also provide that compliance time machine, which is that window in time to look back and be able to see compliance on any date and time. So moving forward. So let's now move to tips to help organizations identify current gaps in their compliance processes to avoid to minimize fines and avoid reputational damage. And so this means we have to have a top-down approach, that compliance management strategy, which then pours into compliance management processes, supported by an information technology architecture. The compliance management strategy is what I was just talking about, that federated compliance, being able to understand and bring these different departments of compliance together, not necessarily under one reporting relationship, but in a collaborative relationship across these different departments and functions into this compliance management strategy that's supported by common compliance management processes, such as regulatory change processes, policy management from authoring, development, communication, maintenance, and retirement of policies, to investigation processes and incident management, and all the sub-processes that flow about that, and having the right information technology architecture that can support that underneath. On the next slide, that means we have to be able to monitor the environment. Monitor the external environment for continuous changes in the external context, such as changes in the laws and regulations, with 257 regulatory change events every business day in financial services globally, shifts in geopolitical and economic risks that might impact our credit and market risks, industry practices and societal environmental standards, shifts in technology, but also monitoring the changes in the internal environment. Our training programs, our requirements, controls, our third-party relationships, what's understood to be acceptable and unacceptable risk in the environment. All that is critically important. Now, moving on from that, we need to monitor all these changes and then apply them into the internal context on the next slide, where we understand these external internal changes. We filter those through the understanding of the mission, vision, values, strategy, process, and roles of the organizations, basically saying, what does this change, this development mean to the organization? We perform our compliance risk assessments and identify the policies that either need to be updated or new policies written, or we need to address communication and training on policies to make people aware of the existing policies to address this changing compliance risk environment to avoid fines and minimize reputational damage related to compliance. So this means we have to have structured processes for monitoring and automating regulatory change that can take in all the different types of content sourcing for regulations, from new regulations, amended regulations, regulatory guidance, news and circulators, comment letters, enforcement actions, feedback statements, and more. Funnel these into a triage process to be able to understand what this means, how does this map to policies, controls our environment, who's the subject matter expert that can then do an impact assessment and build out action plans to be able to address this continuous regulatory change in our environment. On the next slide, we need defensible metrics. As I already referenced, the Department of Justice and regulators, they want to know who, what, when, how, and why, to monitor the ambiguity and questions and clarity that's coming in on compliance, so that we can clarify that, so we can minimize reputational damage and fines by answering people's questions so we don't get in the hot waters of non-compliance, monitoring proper approvals and risk exposure, monitoring changing regulation and legislation, as well as an external developing risk environment from geopolitical risks and economic risks and operational risks around the world, applying that to business change, monitoring and managing incidents and issues on compliance so that we minimize damage and exposure to the organization, documenting exceptions to policies and controls for compliance so that when regulators or external auditors come knocking on the door, we have that documented and why. Responding to issues of noncompliance, proper delivery of policies, training on policies, attestation of policies, communication of policies, with a robust audit trail and system of record related to all of that. Organizations, financial service organizations today need ongoing monitoring, metrics, and measurement for all these different areas of compliance to provide a robust, defensible posture to be able to avoid fines and minimize reputational damage when it comes to compliance risks. So with that, I'm going to turn this back over to ClauseMatch to hear some of their perspective.
Thanks, Michael. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is from the perspective of the clients and the work that I do with our clients and with other interested parties in the way that ClauseMatch works, such as our partners. For context, I'm principal consultant at ClauseMatch. My role is largely to help our clients achieve success with our product. And that means really understanding them, their challenges and their exposures, but also the opportunities for their growth. I come from a background of not just regulatory sort of change in technology, but also in public policy. So helping the development of legislation and prudential standards. Even relatively early on in the scheme of things in my career, I've got a good interest and good sort of examination of some of the practices. One of the main things that I wanted to talk about today, well, in fact, the main thing I want to talk about today, is this concept of traceability that I see a lot that comes up in a lot of the discussions that I'll have on regulatory change and managing compliance. It's this concept that there's this value chain from regulations and regulatory change kind of on your left-hand side as the sort of cause for change that prompts a process of interpretation and then in response in terms of artifacts that demonstrate compliance. So we'll talk a bit about traceability as a concept and as a way it kind of is, from what I've seen, the MO for a lot of clients that work in financial, a lot of our financial services clients and what they ask me to help them with. How I've been able to sort of help them at a fundamental level accomplish this traceability, how I want to see these organizations grow in terms of what's next and getting meta about the way that they perform this activity, and then to go a step beyond that still and get into the reg tech and sup tech possibilities for the near future and imminent future, in fact. So we'll move on to sort of defining this traceability concept. So I talked about it in a high level just a moment ago, but I've heard it called many things: regulatory mapping, regulatory adherence. It's kind of a regional kind of idea, I guess, depends what you call it. But the principle, as I mentioned, it kind of comprises three common activities. There's deviations and changes and things like that. But what I see all the time is some concept of horizon scanning. That is searching your external environment for information about what the public expects of your organization. I've purposely said, avoided this word regulation in that horizon scanning sentence, even though a lot of discussion about horizon scanning is about what's in our regulations. But as Michael was just putting to us, it's enforcement actions as well, but tying into the reputational risk kind of lens as well is the way that your organization is considered by the public, as well what the members of your organization are telling the world about you. All of that information is highly relevant to what you should be seeking out and searching in your external environment that gives you an indication of what the world expects from you and your organization, right? Following that, your process for finding that information, a process of interpretation occurs inside that organization, where usually some sort of subject matter expert aligned to particular taxonomy that's been determined ahead of time, that taxonomy being the areas that are most relevant and most strategically important to that organization. I work mainly, almost exclusively with financial services. So what I see often is that this regulatory taxonomy is very closely aligned to their risk appetite statement and to the risks that the board has called out as key to manage in that organization. A process of interpretation occurs to say, well, what is it that the world expects of us? But also who in our organizations does it expect it from? What parts of it are affected? Did we see this coming? Were you positioned to address it? That kind of reflective process. And following the output of that is, I guess, the output of that is some sort of object that contains information about the organization's understanding of what the board expects of it. So a real amalgam of that public information and the internal information, how well it can understand those expectations. And lastly, tracing. So being able to take that object, that regulatory obligation, that interpretation, and match it up and connect it using some sort of technology or data to the parts in your organization that show that you think about this expectation, that you have some sort of way of meeting it, matching it, exceeding it, addressing it in some way, and then you can demonstrate that that posture to your public expectation. This is the gist of what I see most commonly with some changes on the margins. And if we go to the next slide, I can show you a visual representation. It's a bit, it's from a client we've worked with. It's older and it's censored a little bit, but the idea that you're seeing here is that in that traceability spectrum, you've got exactly what I was talking about a moment ago with a bit of a twist. You've got on the left-hand side all this horizon scanning content, in this case, very much focused on regulations, although we said doesn't have to be, proceeding to an interpretive process that develops objects of obligation that are then used as the point evidence of the organization's policies, procedures, its controls, and also its disclosures directly to customers. And on that far right end, a separate process that is always ingesting new information following another interpretive process about what regulations are relevant and what needs to form this sort of obligation assessment. So this is a lot of what I've helped organizations with using the Clause Match platform. But more generally, what they've come to me and saying, well, look, this is how we want to address a lot of the challenges that Michael was pointing out. How can you help us with it? So if we can go to the next point, I can talk a little bit about that. The way I want to talk about is cover the first 2 points first about, well, how can you get traceability to start? Once you've got traceability, how can you be meta and sort of ask how well your traceability is going? No surprise, your RegTech panelist is going to tell you to use technologies that allow you to pinpoint, contextualize, collaborate, monitor, and report on each part of that journey, or each part of that value chain, I should say. So self-explanatory, if you don't have the tools to be able to do this, it's going to be very difficult to accomplish it. I've seen a variety of approaches for different sizes of organization. It doesn't have to be the biggest and most expensive tool on the block to get the job done. It has to be commensurate with the complexity of what the public expects of you. That's what I would say. But of course, you have to know how to use them. And so what I suggest is that if you don't have a framework document that approaches how you accomplish traceability and train your organization on exactly how to perform this, this is a pitfall that you can see with RegTech adoption. It's a technology. It's capable of performing a role and doing a purpose, but without the embedded standards as to how your organization are aligned in using it, it's going to be more difficult to get that value out of it. And in line with that, sort of what I was describing previously, that traceability model, what I showed you was extremely basic, but it can start that way. Just start simply and improve feedback on iterations. Probably the next thing that I would say to that diagram I showed previously was show me the evidence that there's some sort of planning or some sort of adoption plan for the changes that obligations are required to impose on us, rather than just point directly to the objects of evidence that point to those. in noticing the time, we'll get into the questions to ask. So if you feel that you do have this traceability in place, I ask you to question it, I suppose, to be very rigorous and skeptical of your own success, because there's a lot of intervening factors and probabilities that mean that you're not always very sure if you have perfectly understood what the public expects of you. So make sure that you have processes conducted in the spirit of humility and intellectual growth of how well do you understand what the public expects of your organization, and how frequently and materially are you wrong. If you don't have a good sense of the negative and don't sort of like perform this acid test on the way that your processes work, you won't know a false positive from just the regular environment, so to speak. The other thing is, well, to evaluate your effectiveness in anticipating changes. So with regulatory change, you can form views about what different governments and what different regulators are going to do over time. You should be thinking about, well, recording those and thinking, well, how well did we do in the way that we prepared for what we anticipated versus what actually turned out. And lastly, I think a taxonomy is most important. I sort of mentioned it before about how it should be aligned to your view of risk. How well does it reflect reality versus the priorities of that organization? That's.
Thanks, Nick. I'm going to hand it back to you, Michael.
Excellent. Just grabbing that video back. I think I'm back there. And some asked me about more detailed reports and articles I have. I put my email address in the chat there, that I'm happy to forward some of that too. But how technology solutions can help you tighten up your control environment, including policies and procedures. So first off here, a lot of financial services organizations, even large ones out there, I find are still very encumbered by documents, spreadsheets, and emails, that they're just encumbering the organization. One mid-sized bank I was talking to on their RFP found out that 80% of their staff time was spent managing documents, spreadsheets, and emails and not managing compliance risk. Another one was spending 200 hours to build a report on compliance risks every year for the board of directors, because it took them 200 employee hours to build a report, because it's all in documents, spreadsheets, and emails, and find out they had compliance risks that started developing 11 months ago. They're out of control today. That's not managing compliance risk. That's reacting to compliance risk. Documents, spreadsheets, and emails for managing these compliance processes to avoid fines, reputational damages are a recipe for disaster. It's the inevitability of failure. First off, you lack a good, strong system of record. Yeah, I can completely manufacture evidence of compliance in documents, spreadsheets, and emails. And regulators are catching up on this. In fact, I was talking to one regional bank that went to technology in this area because the regulator had come in and said, you're not going to pass your next regulatory exam if you continue to manage compliance in documents, spreadsheets, and emails. We want to see a complete audit trail and system of record. What was assessed for compliance on what date and time? What policies were communicated? Who communicated those? What were on the compliance risk assessment and evaluation? Who did that? If somebody came back 2 weeks later and changed or modified that, date, timestamp, audit record of who did that, what was changed, why it was changed. And documents, spreadsheets, and emails don't get you that audit trail and system of record. So organizations, on the next slide, need a strong compliance architecture that can take in a lot of distributed, disconnected compliance data points, just like we heard from ClausMatch a few minutes ago, and being able to take in all these different types and sources of regulations and developments and things, understand these contextually and be able to map them together, analyze relationships and what this means to the organization, and build out action items. But what's really critical is what I've already stated when it comes to technology, and that's on the next slide, that organizations need defensible compliance. What was that policy on what date and time? As that regulation changed, what policy was evaluated? What policy was communicated to employees and attested to by employees? Well, what are the auditable records around that? Do we meet our requirements? Were there exceptions to policies that were documented? Were they properly approved? And so forth. And so we need defensible compliance, an audit trail and system of record that documents, spreadsheets, and emails alone don't get you. that you need strong technology to be able to manage this process and be able to deliver that audit trail and system of record around this. Now, the benefits that we can receive from this approach is the ability to achieve business objectives while remaining compliant. Ensure there's compliance risk-aware setting of objectives and strategic planning to make sure we don't step out of bounds as we manage our objectives and do our strategic plans. It's also, good, strong technology like ClausMatch and others is there to define, guide, and enhance the organizational culture of compliance, increase stakeholder confidence in compliance, prepare and protect the organization to be agile to compliance, but also preventing, detecting, and reducing adversity, weakness, and exposure on compliance, and motivate and inspire desired conduct of employees to that be ethical conduct and compliance related conduct to be able to avoid issues of compliance, to be able to have that good horizon scanning to see what's coming at us on the horizon from regulatory change and compliance developments to stay ahead of the game, improve responsiveness and efficiency of our compliance resources, and ultimately optimize the economic return and value to the organization. All this, when you put this together, is the benefits of 360-degree contextual awareness of compliance. And so in that context, on the next slide, we need to be able to manage that and understand the awareness of compliance, that what regulations are changing out there, how does it impact our complex services and processes within the financial services organization, to be able to align it and be able to work together, to be more responsive to regulatory change developments, but also be agile in our processes as well, so that we can do that horizon scanning and see what's developing on the horizon for regulatory change and how that's going to impact our processes and policies, to be more resilient in a very risky world that we live in, as well as be efficient in our use of human and financial capital resources. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to ClausMatch for our concluding remarks.
Thank you again, Michael. So passing sort of last thought, I kind of prefaced or promised that we talk about three kinds of improvements on traceability and sort of processes to get to the next steps with compliance, risk management, and therefore avoiding reputational risk as well. Once you have that reflexive sort of process in place, a lot of what we were talking about just a moment ago, the next stage for me is then a different posture from regulatory technology that comes from the idea that we can kind of proceed a bit more with RegTech actually intervening and being more of an interface into the way that the organization works. What I mean by this, and I kind of spelled this out in a little article I wrote for the RegTech Black Book recently. It's sort of available on my LinkedIn, that article. The idea being that RegTech and a lot of compliance technologies, they offer a very good map. They offer a very good representation of exactly where things are, that concept of traceability, being able to see exactly how things move from regulation to interpretation to evidence. What I want to see next is better powers to change, to use that map as an interface to change the way things operate directly using the tooling. What I see a lot is that from a traceability exercise, there is an action plan that's Michael sort of showed that earlier, that at the end of that process, you end up with action items and an action plan, and that's very well. What I also want to see, and I think what comes next, particularly with the advancement of supervisory technologies, is the ability to then change immediately using a regulatory technology tool, how that will work. A very good example is regulatory reporting, where you'll be able to take that regulation, do your traceability, but offer counterfactuals and offer, well, if this regulatory reporting requirement were interpreted differently, if different asset classes were interpreted differently, this would be the result versus this other being the result, and be able to use that RegTech tool as an interface to put counterfactuals to regulators and supervisors, and to and to more directly engage and use that engagement as influence on the outcomes of regulatory compliance activity. Noting the time, of course, and giving sort of time for questions, I won't get into all of the detail on that, but that article is sort of available. I may will put a link in the chat. But I may hand it to Amanda, and also thank Michael for really riveting sort of content. I really appreciate it. Might hand over to Amanda.
Great, thank you so much. All right, I know we are running out of time, so I think we are going to skip the Q&A. However, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box and we can address them after the webinar is over. And with that, before we conclude, I just wanted to let you guys know, Michael, as well as ClauseMatch, are hosting 2 in-person workshops next week in the US, one in Charlotte, North Carolina, and one in Atlanta, Georgia. So you can use that QR code to register for those workshops, and we'll include a link to the workshops in a follow-up email as well. And then lastly, I think my image might be covering it, but we're also hosting a workshop in London on the 9th of June. So we're still kind of finalizing the details for that, but we'll promote it once that's finalized. So with that, I wanted to say thank you to our panelists, Michael and Nick, for your informative insights. And thank you everyone for attending. As a reminder, we'll send a link to the presentation as well as the recording no later than this Thursday. So thank you everyone. I hope you have a good rest of your day. Take care. Bye.